The Black Dahlia is the coldest of cold cases, a case so old the detective in charge of the investigation wasn't born at the time of the homicide. Hi everyone, my name is Holmes, and today we're going to be talking about one of the most famous unsolved murder cases in American history, the Black Dahlia case. Betty Short was born on July 29, 1924. Her life in many ways was pretty tragic. Her early life was spent in Medford, Massachusetts, and when she was just 5 years old, her family was struck by the Great Depression, as many Americans were. Her father built miniature golf courses for a living, but in 1930 that business was completely squashed, and her father subsequently abandoned them. To make matters even worse, she also suffered from asthma, prompting her to move to Florida at the age of 16 to escape the harsh winters of Massachusetts. This would be her first time moving, and a life that would be full of constant moving. Unlike what articles stated about her personality, she was described by a multitude of people, such as neighbors and actresses, as being a pretty and nice girl who was well-behaved and innocent, which contradicts most articles that painted her as this party-goer. The worst that could be said is that she was sometimes a tease. Eventually, her father, Cleo Short, would return, sending her some money, and she subsequently moved in with him in California. However, their relationship was never close, as she was out of the house more often than not before moving back to Florida in 1944, following an arrest. It's commonly believed that she earned this nickname due to the press, but it was actually conceived at a drugstore Betty used to frequent in Long Beach. Customers would often call her the Black Dahlia due to how she wore her hair and because of the popular 1946 film, The Blue Dahlia. Towards the end, she took a trip to San Diego and ended up moving into the household of the French family. They described her again as never staying in the home. She was always out and about. During one of her times out, she met a man named Robert Red Manley, who she got along great with and who even offered her a job interview, which she would never attend. After getting kicked out of the French family's home, she went to Manley, who drove her back to LA and dropped her off at the Biltmore Hotel late on January 9th in what would be the last time anyone saw her alive. For 6 days, she was unaccounted for until the morning of the 15th. And speaking of tragedy, it's time to go back to that day, January 15th, 1947. As stated before, she was spotted in an undeveloped lot on South Norton Avenue, where she was drained of blood and resembled a mannequin more than a human. The most disturbing part was that she was cut into 2 pieces between the second and third lumbar vertebrae, and the cut was so clean that not a single internal organ was even touched, suggesting that this could have only been done by a skilled surgeon. Her arms, legs, and neck all featured ligature marks, indicating that she was tied down. The death had been brought on by multiple lacerations to her face after being knocked unconscious by repeated blows to the head. The mutilation occurred after she passed away. She was also heavily washed, and as such, no fingerprints could be found, a key reason why this mystery has lasted to this day. Betty was identified by law enforcement after matching her fingerprints with the prints taken following her arrest in 1943. After the identification, Betty's mother, Phoebe, had to be informed of what happened to her child. Unfortunately, the LAPD were not the ones to break it to her. It was the Examiner rewrite man, Wayne Sutton, and city editor Jimmy Richardson, who called Phoebe and told her that Betty had won a beauty contest. They prodded her for information about Betty until they felt she wasn't giving anything useful. They then bluntly told Phoebe her daughter hadn't won anything, she was dead. One other strange event worth noting was that 10 days after the investigation, the Examiner was mailed some of Betty's personal belongings, which included her social security card, birth certificate, and an old address book with some missing pages that belonged to the aforementioned Mark Hansen. All other letters sent in were deemed hoaxes by the LAPD, and no fingerprints were retrieved from the letter. So now that we have a background of who Betty was as a person and have explained the condition of the body, we're going to jump right into the suspects. We're going to heavily narrow it down to include the most popular suspects. So without further ado, let's dive in. The first suspect we must talk about is Robert Manley, who we mentioned earlier. If you don't remember, Manley was the very last person with her, as he was the man that dropped Betty off at the Biltmore, and as such, he has always been a very popular suspect in this case. But was Manley actually behind this? Well, let's first look at who Robert Manley actually was. There isn't a ton of information available about Manley, but we do know that he was in the military and was actually discharged due to mental illness. Because of this and the fact that he hooked up with Betty, it's easy to understand why he was such a popular suspect. When investigators found out about this information, they ran a polygraph test on him, which he passed, although it's worth noting that early polygraphs were primitive and couldn't be used in court anyway. Jumping way forward to the 50s, he was committed to a mental hospital where, for one final time, they ran another test on him to see if he was truly behind this case after all. And once again, it was proven that he was not. Apparently, these never-ending suspicions on whether or not he was a suspect of this case really destroyed Manley mentally, who was already an unstable man. The next suspect that we felt the need to shed some light on was Mark Hansen. Mark Hansen was the business manager of the Florentine Gardens nightclub. The Danish-born businessman also ran quite a few second-run theaters in the LA area, such as the Mark Hall, and was famously shy in private. The reason he became a suspect was because of the items sent to the Examiner 10 days after the event, which, as we stated, contained an address book owned by Hansen himself. Betty actually lived with Hansen on 2 separate occasions, where 2 different moments of friction caused her to move out. Originally, Betty and a friend lived with Hansen, but Hansen apparently did not like her friend, which caused both of them to move out. Her friend eventually left Hollywood, but Betty moved back to Hansen's place as she had nowhere else to go. Hansen was married at the time, but this didn't stop him from flirting with various women, possibly including Betty, but it didn't go any further than that. Again, though, it's easy to see why he is such a popular suspect, but is he truly the man that did it? Definitely not. Hansen had absolutely no criminal record at all in his entire lifetime, despite what is often claimed. He also didn't have the necessary medical skills required to mutilate her body. Hansen's life was very much shaken up by Betty's death and an attempted murder by a striptease girl in 1949. But our next guy, Leslie Dillon, has one of the most interesting cases out of anybody, being that he actually contacted the LAPD himself. He lived in Florida, not LA. The reason he contacted them was because he was an aspiring writer who was fascinated by the case after reading about it. All we know about him from his life before this case is that he was a bellhop and at one point worked as a mortician's assistant for 3 weeks in Oklahoma City. He drove the ambulance for those 3 weeks. For the record, many people say that he was a morgue attendant, but this is not true. When contacting the LAPD, he would often have exchanges with a psychologist. During their exchange, Dillon said that he believed his friend Jeff Connors was actually responsible for this death. Eventually, the psychologist started believing that Connors never even existed, and that Leslie actually created him in his head to cope with what he had done. The psychologist managed to trick Dillon into meeting him, leading to a long interrogation in which Dillon was treated very harshly. In the meantime, it's worth noting that DeRiver had a rather poor reputation in history prior to this event. He was not the most reliable of people. For about a day, it looked like the case was solved, but instead of confessing, Dillon sued. This led to a long public court trial which cleared him of any suspicion. The city of LA even had to pay him for all the damages. A key detail learned during this trial was that Dillon was actually in San Francisco on the date of January 15th, so it could not possibly be him. And the next suspect is actually a notable serial killer known as the Lipstick Killer. In recent years, many people believe that the Lipstick Killer was, in fact, the one behind this. So let's go over why this has become such a popular theory. In 1946, 3 women were brutally murdered, with one having a message written in red lipstick. It was an extremely disturbing case, but if you already know about this killer, I'm sure you are questioning something right now, and that is, how could it possibly be the Lipstick Killer if he was arrested in 1946? Being arrested in 1946, This date would obviously make no sense, since the tragedy we're discussing happened in 1947. But that's where the theories come in. It's thought of by some people that the person who was arrested wasn't the lipstick killer. As of now, this theory most likely sounds like some ridiculous conspiracy, but the case is fairly controversial as to whether the person who was actually arrested did the murders. There is evidence for and against this. The man who wound up being arrested and who served the rest of his life in prison was a kid named William Hirons, and he was officially arrested in 1946 when he was just 17. Keep in mind, tensions were high at this time because these killings were quite horrific and the city of Chicago was demanding justice. Besides the time span making sense, there isn't anything that matches between these two cases. The victims of the lipstick killer didn't really share anything much in common with the Black Dahlia murder, outside of the last victim being dismembered. There is, however, one other suspect that was also a serial killer, and he was known as the Cleveland Torso Killer. This one is immediately more convincing because every single body that this man got his hands on was dismembered, and they were also done in a way that clearly shows expertise in the medical field. From the years of 1935 to 1938, the Cleveland Torso Killer took an estimated 12 to 20 lives. Another noteworthy similarity was the type of victims he would seek out, which were nearly always drifters or homeless people. And with poor Betty basically being a vagrant, her profile matches up with the type of people this person sought out. Despite sounding extremely convincing from the surface, none of them were cut in half like Betty. All of his victims were either missing limbs or they were decapitated. The dates for this one are certainly strange as well. Seeing how the spree abruptly ended for seemingly no reason in 1938, there are multiple theories as to why this spree ended so suddenly, such as the suspect either being killed or locked up. The torso killer was technically never found. Unlike the lipstick killer, the LAPD actually addressed the two cases' similarities and concluded that there was no connection, and it makes sense. The torso killer's victims were all dismembered and hidden. They were not meant to be found. Betty was placed in a spot where plenty of people walked by every single day. She was meant to be found. Now we have Corporal Joseph Dum, and his situation was quite strange. He was one of the early suspects involved in the case, and unlike most of these suspects, he actually completely admitted to being behind it all. The thing is, though, this was completely untrue. His reasoning for being behind it all was claiming to have dated Betty. Secondly, and more importantly, it was concluded that Dum was actually stationed in Fort Dix, New Jersey during this time span, so what he was saying was completely false. After this was proven, Dum was dropped as a potential lead, and the paper stopped covering him. But why would he do this? At first, I thought he was an idiot, but upon looking, there were no confirmed cases of this being the case. The much more likely scenario was simply that he was just looking for notoriety and attention, which he definitely got, as he was considered one of the top suspects for a short while. This next lead is another pretty ridiculous one and is only a lead because of the ludicrous thinking of the 1940s. People thought that because Betty left her bags at the bus depot and that she had survived a week without changing clothes, she had to have had someone with her, and they actually assumed it was a woman. They then very quickly jumped to the conclusion that it must have been a lesbian doctor, and this doctor killed Betty because of a love triangle. This side of the investigation has caused various retellings of Betty's story to list her as a lesbian, when that was not true. In fact, it was quite the opposite, as she was said to be quite homophobic. With such a ridiculous theory of her being killed by some hypothetical lesbian doctor. But this theory was actually mentioned in the 2006 film The Black Dahlia, making this one a pretty popular theory. Out of all the ridiculous suspects we have listed thus far, this one stands alone in the fact that there literally isn't even a suspect. This is all purely a hypothetical scenario derived from the thinking of the 1940s and the awful assumption that lesbians are murderous monsters. It is incredibly easily debunked in case you actually did believe this one, which apparently some people still do. Again, Betty was homophobic, which already throws this theory on its head. Also, the number of female surgeons in the United States at this time was remarkably slim. The next suspect we had to cover is the most important one in the entire video. And if you have any familiarity with this case, I'm sure you guys were getting ready for his name to be finally shown. That is, of course, George Hill Hodell Jr. George Hodell is by far the most famous suspect in this case. And among the public, he is commonly considered the man that did it. This is all due to the actions of his son, Steve Hodell, who was a former LAPD detective, who came out with an immense amount of information as to why his dad was, in fact, the killer all along. George Hodell in his earlier years was a talented pianist at a very young age and a genius, scoring an incredibly high IQ score of 186. George Hodell operated a clinic that helped poor African Americans who lived in a part of town called Brownsville. His first notable moment of controversy came in 1945, though, when his secretary, Ruth Spaulding, committed suicide. Fast forwarding to 1947, when Betty was killed, anyone with a medical background was under suspicion. In 1949, there was actually a trial against George by his daughter, Tamar, who claimed that he was sexually abusing her. Because of that trial, George now came into the police's attention and was officially a suspect. After George's death in 1999, Steve wanted to discover more about his dad. He claims to have found 2 photos in his basement when he was looking through his dad's stuff. And these 2 photos he found strongly resembled Betty, which sent him on a hunt to uncover the truth about whether his dad was truly behind the Black Dahlia murder all along. Unfortunately, he published his findings and became so famous that as of now, he's a best-sellered novelist, and he has appeared in episodes of TV shows like Ghost Adventures and The Dr. Phil Show. Even from the very beginning of the story, we can already find flaws in his claims. Those 2 photos that he claimed were of Betty have both been proven as false. The first picture was identified as a person named Maria Marco, and the second photo was debunked by Betty's family themselves. Our last and final suspect is Walter Alonzo Bailey, and the reason I have saved him for last is because he's the only person out of every known suspect that has legitimate evidence that shows that he could have actually done it. According to Larry, this all started in 1996, while he was researching this case for the 50th anniversary of the murder. People were sending in pieces of evidence they found that were marginally related to the case. The majority of these findings, while interesting, were in the end just throwaways. During this research, Larry consulted with the legendary criminal profiler John E. Douglas, famous for having played a role in the capture of the Trailside Killer and the Atlanta child killer, helped advance understanding of criminal psychology. Douglas put together a profile for the killer, and while even he would admit it's not perfect, it does narrow down the list a little bit. This is an abbreviated version of what Douglas wrote. He was a white man, no younger than his late 20s and possibly older, with a high school education. He lived alone, made his living working with his hands rather than his brains, was adept with a knife, and was comfortable wallowing in blood. He was rigid, patient, compulsive, and deliberate. He drank alcohol, and when he was drunk, he became argumentative. He probably had a police record for either threatening or assaulting someone with a knife. The killer was under great personal and financial stress. He and Short spent several days together. He had been drinking, maybe he had a physical handicap or stuttered, and Short made fun of it, but she rejected him. The mixture of personal stress, alcohol, and rejection exploded into a murderous rage. Cutting the body in half was simply to make transportation easier, but the level of mutilation reflects a personal rage directed at her. He was dehumanizing her and effeminizing her, and then he cut that smile into her face. You can just imagine him saying, "Look who has the last laugh now." Eventually, one day, Larry received a letter much like all the other ones he had gotten, but this one was a bit different. He received a photocopy of an old wedding certificate between Betty's sister, Virginia, and a man named Adrian West, and it showed that they got married in Inglewood. Larry decided to explore Inglewood and find the home where Virginia and Adrian got married. When he did, he was met with a shocking discovery. This house was only 1 block away from where the murder took place. Because the certificate he had on him was a photocopy, he wanted to find a real copy just to make sure, and when he did, it relayed the same information. He now had 2 members of the Short family connected within a block of each other. It was addressed to Barbara Lindgren. So now Larry's next step was to figure out who she was. Figuring out who Barbara was a long and strenuous process. He started out by directly reaching out to Virginia and Adrian's children and gave them the backstory. The home the wedding took place at belonged to a couple from the church. The members of the wedding were all from the church, and one of these members was Barbara Lindgren. The address on the wedding certificate that had Barbara's name on turned out to belong to Ruth Bailey, who was Barbara's mother. But Larry's heart dropped when he found out Barbara's father was Walter Bailey. And guess what? Walter Bailey was a prominent surgeon. Apparently, in the mid-1940s, Walter Bailey was a prominent member of the LA medical community and even had a private workspace just 5 blocks away from the Biltmore Hotel, which was where Bailey was last seen. Bailey was born on March 25, 1880, the second of 3 brothers and a sister. He graduated in 1905 and quickly became the associate professor of surgery at the University of Southern California. He specialized in women's surgery and treatment. In 1910, he moved to a small town of Dawson, New Mexico, and worked as a surgeon for the coal mining company stationed there. He enlisted in the Marine Corps in 1918 and served in World War I as a surgeon. He left in 1919. After the war, he moved to Los Angeles and stayed there for the rest of his life. In 1946, things would change for Bailey, though. He lost his positions as the chief of staff at County Hospital and associate professor of surgery at USC. He was now under financial stress. To make matters worse, he found a woman named Alexandra von Park-Ticha. Alexandra was a nurse, and this newfound romantic relationship caused Bailey to file for divorce. To somehow make matters even worse, he also started showing the early signs of Alzheimer's disease, which was ultimately the cause of his death. He also suffered from a condition that caused the brain to physically shrink. A few weeks before he died, he changed his will and left everything to Alexandra. But because the divorce still wasn't final, Ruth carried out a lawsuit and spine-chillingly claimed that Alexandra knew a terrible secret about him that would ruin him if it became public. The type of condition that Bailey suffered from has been known to trigger violence in people with no record. People close to Bailey claimed he was a kind man, but he wasn't the same person he was in his final years. He was also very desensitized to violence, reportedly watching filmed autopsies and surgeries with his mistress while eating dinner. Another important detail is that Bailey had a son named Walter Prescott Bailey, who was hit by a car at the age of 11. Betty had a sob story she would use involving losing a son, and she would often use this to garner sympathy. Walter Prescott's birthday was January 13th, and Betty was killed either late on the 14th or early on the 15th. It's plausible that Betty had gone to ask Bailey for financial help and ended up staying for a few days. At one point, she may have mentioned the dead son's story and accidentally sent the mentally ill doctor off. Now, that's completely a hypothetical scenario. It may not be why he did what he did, but the fact remains that Bailey's resume is way too convincing to overlook. He was a skilled surgeon. He lived 1 block away from the spot Betty was found at. His private workspace was 5 blocks away from the hotel that Betty was last seen at. And he was literally proven to know her, which would explain the missing pages in Betty's address book. You would only remove pages if she had written the killer's name down prior to her death. While not exact, Bailey fits John Douglas's profile better than any suspect in the case. It would also explain why there was no other murder quite like Betty's in LA history. If it was Bailey, this wasn't the work of a serial killer. Rather, it was one murder committed by a man with a quickly failing mind. The evidence in favor of Walter Bailey is far less flimsy than the countless other suspects. Fast forwarding back to the present, the Black Dahlia mystery is arguably one of the most famous unsolved murder mysteries in the history of the United States, and may also hold the record for being one of the most misinformed mysteries of all time. With all being said and done, Who do you guys think did the murder? Let me know in the comments.